Before we end, I want to ask you something a little bit more personal, and it's something that's always intrigued me about you. Your parents, I think your father was originally from Ukraine. Your mum was from what's now known as Belarus. Both were Jews, both arrived in the United States, and it's perhaps fair to say that had they not made it to the United States, they would have been killed.
Sure.
Faced terrible turmoil.
Like the rest of the family who didn't come. Yeah.
Your work for more than 40 years has focused on what you call the terrorism, the criminal acts of the United States. And yet, your parents knew America as a safe haven, as a place of opportunity, of security. How did those two elements of your life fit together?
Very simply, the same way they did for my parents. Yes, it's a land of opportunity, and in fact we know why. It's a land of opportunity because the British colonists came and effectively exterminated the indigenous population, which is a typical property of settler colonialism, the worst kind of imperialism, conquered half of Mexico, instituted slavery, committed huge crimes, and created a rich, prosperous country from which I benefit enormously. Well, there's an elementary moral principle, and since then have gone on to carry out horrendous crimes everywhere. The Vietnam War alone is probably, I think, the worst crime since the Second World War. Maybe 4 million people killed, 3 countries devastated. These are real crimes, and there are many others.
Well, I don't want to go into too much detail. I think it's more the style of argument that I'm getting at now.
Well, see, I think the style of argument should be that we should tell the truth about important things. And for each of us, and this is an elementary moral principle, the most important thing for each of us is the predictable consequences of our own actions. It's very easy to condemn the crimes of others. So, Stalinist hacks condemned the crimes of the West. I don't applaud them for that. I applaud the Soviet dissidents who condemned the crimes of the Soviet Union. And it's the same for each of us, in individual life or anywhere else.
But Noam Chomsky's world is a black and white world when it comes to the United States. You constantly focus upon what you regard as the evils done, the crimes committed by the United States.
For a reason.
What about the good things that the United States does? What about the reasons which drive millions of people from the poorest parts of this planet to want to live in the United States, to be American?
In the richest country in the world, yeah. And I'm glad my parents came here, otherwise they would have been in death camps. But sure, that's true. And in fact, what you say is not, and just consider these last few minutes of discussion. One of the things that I did was praise the United States. Praise it for the significant changes that civilized the society substantially in the last 40 years, coming from popular activism. Or take, say, freedom of speech, which I talk about all the time. It's one of the highest values. It's protected in the United States beyond any country in the world that I know of. It's a major achievement. It doesn't go back to the Bill of Rights. It substantially comes from the Civil Rights Movement. The major Supreme Court cases establishing a high standard of freedom of speech were in connection with civil rights movement actions. So yes, there are very great things that have happened. I talk about them all the time. They come primarily from popular activism, which is directed against the crimes of the country. In fact, I'm struck by the changes in the last 40 years, which have come from an organized, active public, much of it initiated by young people, students and others, and it's had a huge effect.
But it hasn't affected the basic power structures in your view.
No, it has not affected the institutions, but it's affected the way they act. And that's quite important. Opposition to the Iraq War, for example, was far higher than opposition to the Vietnam War at any comparable stage. And it's had an impact. In Iraq, it was bad enough, but the U.S. and Britain could not do what they did in Vietnam. The population would never have tolerated it. Yes, those are important changes.
I think it would be fair to say that you've always had an extraordinary confidence in your own righteousness. And as you enter your 80s, I just wonder, are you as sure about being right now as you ever were?
Yes, but I was never that sure.
Because you come across as extraordinarily
Well,
sure.
you know, if you have to state an opinion in 2 seconds, it sounds very confident. But I think I mentioned earlier that in the sciences, you have a framework of understanding. You pursue what you think is important, but you maintain in the back of your mind the recognition you may be off on completely the wrong track, and you have to backtrack.
Is that in the back of your mind today?
Always. And if I, for example, you say there's a flood of criticism. Actually, I welcome it, and I read it carefully, and I look to see if there's anything there that's valid. And with astonishing consistency, there's nothing there, as in the case that you mentioned about the dissent and denazification. The context is always eliminated. When you put the context back in, I think almost any normal person would say that's the right thing to respond.
Professor Noam Chomsky, we were out of time, but thank you very much for being on HARDtalk.
Thank you.